Sure.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. We're going to begin.
Welcome to the Health Equity and Translational Social Science research thread in the NPI and Department of Psychiatry. And I'm super excited today to be presenting Dr. Carolyn Parker. She's got a phenomenal topic, very upsetting, that we should all become experts in if we care about anyone in the United States who's gets over incarcerated, which is which is actually more people than any other place in the world per capita with respect to our country. So Dr. Carolyn is currently a presidential fellow of medical anthropology at Manchester University's Department of Social Anthropology in England. And that means we owe you a deep thanks for having the physical stamina and discipline to have traveled whatever, probably 20 hours to get here because of traffic. She'll be talking about the tragedy of carceral citizenship that gets imposed on Puerto Ricans, both in Puerto Rico and its diaspora in the United States. And she received her PhD in 2019 from Columbia University in the Department of Socio-Medical Sciences and Anthropology. And she teaches medical anthropology, specializing in the Caribbean and in its diaspora. So, and on focusing on racial capitalism and health disparities. So she's established a new social responsibility initiative, University in Prison, which is currently developing its first pilot to deliver higher education in the social sciences and humanities to incarcerated learners in Manchester Prison. So thank you for coming here, and thank you for refreshing our benighted country with respect to the cruelties of health disparities related to incarceration, making us hopefully more aware of the Caribbean here in California. No one really knows the Caribbean exists in California, to our detriment. And I wish more Caribbeans knew California existed and didn't get sort of ethnically cleansed and disappeared when they arrived. And you're welcome here, Caribbeans, and you to talk to us, and it's all yours.
Thank you, Philippe. Wow, what an introduction, and thanks everyone. Am I in the right? I'm here. All right. Wait, why is my face so big? Can I have the presentation instead of my face? Yeah, great. Thank you for having me here. It's great to be able to talk about an unfinished book that is still in ongoing process of revision, and it's a really nice time to share unfinished work with people who are smarter than you. It's kind of my favorite professional move. So I'm really excited to be here, and it's really nice of Helena, who pretty much held my hand all the way through my PhD to bring me here. And it's really nice that you introduced me, because if I hadn't read Righteous Dopamine when I was 21, I never would have thought anthropology was cool. So thank you for that. But I'll just crack on, because what I want to do today is trial out just some of the ideas in the book, and also do like a little bits of reading. So it's not a really smooth, comprehensive, this is everything. It's just kind of trialing out some material. So I did most of the fieldwork for this book in 2016 and 2017. So I've been working in Puerto Rico for the last 9 years. And I had initially thought I'd write a book about mutual aid and the ways that people take things into their own hands when the state doesn't do enough. But strangely enough, that led me straight to criminal justice and straight to the carceral state, which wasn't exactly where I'd expected to go. And it did this because of the surprising role that formerly incarcerated men and women in Puerto Rico have come to play in carceral state formation. So most of my current work now looks anthropologically at the human and cultural dimensions of carceral estate formation in the Americas. And the book that I'll be talking us through today focuses primarily on new kinds of unpaid and underpaid work that is understood to be volunteer work that takes place in criminal justice settings. The book is called Carceral Citizens. So I wanted to kind of just dive in with like a little chat about what citizenship means in the context of Puerto Rico. And I think this audience is not going to need a history lesson on Puerto Rico's constitutional status, but perhaps I'll just recap some lesser known racial history of US citizenship as applied to Puerto Rico in 1917. So the photo you can see on the board was taken in 1899, a year after US occupation, and it comes from a local newspaper. If you can see the text, it says a group of newly made Americans at Ponce. So in 1899, Puerto Rican people, of course, would not have been US citizens. It took nearly 20 years, or until 1917, for the US to bestow US citizenship on Puerto Ricans. And though the debates about whether Puerto Ricans should or should not become US citizens occurred between 1898 and 1917, so several decades after African Americans would have been granted US citizenship, Puerto Ricans will have faced many of the same prevailing prejudices as African Americans. So as you can see on the board, these are all comments cited by American lawmakers in Congress. They're all publicly available in congressional records. American lawmakers commonly described Puerto Ricans as a quote unquote Mongol race. They were said to be polluted, quote unquote, with African blood. This quite nauseating quote from Representative Joseph Cannon of Illinois, the former Speaker of the House, comes from the final congressional debate about Puerto Rican citizenship status. And he stated to Congress that the people of Puerto Rico have not the slightest conception of self-government. About 30% are pure African and 80% has an African strain in their blood. So this is very much the caliber of the conversation at the time. And this question of Puerto Ricans' racial identity, right? Were they Black, were they white, were they mixed? Where's there a place for mixed race people in the Union? Was saturated in all of these debates for several years. And one of the things the US does shortly after occupying Puerto Rico was to conduct a racial census to establish what the racial makeup is of the island. And in 1899, this would have been done by the War Department. And that first US census, it nudged Puerto Ricans into choosing between two options. One was white and one was colored. Puerto Rico at this time will have been home to the descendants of between 40 and 50,000 African slaves brought there during the Spanish Empire. But in this first US census, just over half, so well, more than a half, 62% opted to identify as white. And this proportion who identified as white would grow steadily throughout the 20th century, leaping from 62% in 1899 to 79.7% white in 1950. So monitoring these early changes, US congressmen were looking to Puerto Rico with optimism. They were infused by the findings. Its inhabitants were said to be tending towards whiteness. And there were still rumblings about whether this mixed race nation could become part of the Union. And this issue was so tightly intertwined that you get this, this fraught compromise, right? Will disambiguate citizenship and statehood. And US Congress finally bestows citizenship on Puerto Rico in 1917, but it's taken upwards of 30 bills to get there, a very contested pathway legislatively. And I just want to take a moment here to think about what this citizenship amounted to. So the Jones Act of 1917 did not smoothly upgrade Puerto Ricans into a homogeneous first-class citizenship status, as we know. Instead, the 1.2 million people who were collectively naturalized, as it would have called, they will have been joining the ranks of a highly stratified and differentiated American populace, right? This is still Jim Crow America. Women in many states still don't have the vote. And so this extension of citizenship to Puerto Rico was not a straightforward promotion to some uncomplicated equal membership, right? We know this story. From the beginning, as remains today, US citizenship was this deeply stratified project on both a legal and a social level. And the stratified nature of this citizenship, of US citizenship, is really important for understanding the changes that occur to citizenship in Puerto Rico when it goes through our carceral turn. We're not starting out from a kind of neutral, rosy portrait to begin with, I guess. So I wanted to understand what happens to citizenship when a carceral turn happens, and we're already in a colonial setting. And I won't focus too much on the federal war on drugs policies that hit Puerto Rico in much the same way as they hit stateside, but there was some striking action taken locally. In the 1990s, doing a big historical jump here, forgive me for that. The pro-statehood party was in power. Governor Pedro Rosselló launched Mano Dura. This was a highly public-facing spectacle of punitive governance. Rosselló, he dispatched the National Guard to occupy public housing complexes and stage mass arrests. He often invited journalists and local media. And many observers of Mano Dura read this highly publicized effort to be tough on crime as an attempt by the pro-statehood party to demonstrate its worth to the mainland when the island's strategic value was seen to be in decline in relation to the US. By the early 2010s, Puerto Rico has more officers per inhabitant than New York City. And these dynamics really come to a head like just after, 2003. This is the year Puerto Rico claimed the pretty calamitous title of having the highest incarceration rate in Latin America, third highest rate in the world. Only places that were higher in 2003 would have been Russia and the US mainland. So unlike the mainland, where, as we know, prison building projects erupt, Puerto Rico launches its war on drugs on a much more shoestring budget. Many of its prisons were still Spanish-era colonial prisons that are basically dungeons, and other new prisons are constructed. Prisons are the more recognizably modern, but there's a chronic shortage of space, and Puerto Rico essentially embarks on this drug conviction spree without making the accompanying investments in prison infrastructure. And this leads to wild levels of overcrowding, to riots, and to murder rates that in one prison reach 1,000 times higher than that of the US mainland. Homicide rates inside prisons. And it also leads to a lot of court fines, a lot of litigation. Puerto Rican prisoners actually managed to sue the government, the Puerto Rican government, for overcrowding, harnessing the US constitutional prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. So between 1980 and 1990, Puerto Rican government hemorrhages over $68 million in court fines. And faced with all of these mounting court fines and this budget deficit and chronic overcrowding, the corrections department is freaking out and looking for a way out of the mess. And this is where former offenders and self-help become relevant. Have any of you heard of Ogagrea? If Helena was here, she would have. So it's famous in Puerto Rico for being a quote unquote addict-led drug rehabilitation program. I'm going to use a lot of non-clinically correct language here because it's the spaces that I work in. Sometimes called therapeutic communities. What Ogagrea pioneered and what other self-help groups emulate in Puerto Rico essentially involved taking drug offenders off the prisoners' rosters. That is, GREA and other organizations like it offer to take on the work of rehabilitation. They often call it re-education, performing a lot of the kind of confinement role that the prisons would do. And so from 1980s onwards, many of these programs start receiving very small stipends from the corrections department to do this work. And this would have started about $10 a day per person, so significantly lower than your incarceration costs. This photo is taken by an American photographer called Jack Delano in 1980. And as you can see, it's kind of hard because of the color, but it's actually set up shop, this Ogagrea program, in a synagogue. And something that's really characteristic of therapeutic communities in Puerto Rico is they're commonly retrofits. Like they crop up in structures designed for other things. I saw them in churches, in fincas like farmhouses, old precincts, some in like abandoned fire stations. So it's these kind of real ad hoc informality going on. And what you have are these formerly incarcerated men and women, but primarily men, some of whom will have histories of substance use disorders, but others who will just have drug-related convictions for being in some way in the drug economy, not necessarily an illness, but they all start setting up their own self-help programs. And by 86, diverted drug offenders are accounting for over half of GREA's intake, and GREA is operating 65 programs across a very small island. And there are similar programs kind of copycatting its methods made by its graduates cropping up too. And to accommodate this increasingly criminalized clientele, these programs have to start making a few institutional changes. So former offenders become responsible for administering various correctional responsibilities on behalf of the carceral state. They're taking urine samples for court-ordered residents. They're informing police of unauthorized leaving. And so what we usually think of as this vast gulf in power between somebody who is, working for the carceral state and a victim of the carceral state here is getting very, very blurred. And there's this recycling of recently incarcerated men into positions ordinarily perhaps occupied by hired professionals, or in a US context at least. And I show in my book that they become responsible even now for doing things like writing case reports and making recommendations to judges. So there's a real dispersion of penal power in these kind of spaces. So this is all a really shoestring kind of take on law and order. No professional care workers, no doctors, no social workers, no armed guards. And the only way that GREA and the organizations like it can survive economically was by dispatching their residents into the streets to sell trinkets and trash bags and bottles of water to members of the community. And this is actually something that blew up in 2015, 2016, as I was on the cusp of my fieldwork. It was like a whole deal in the NGO rights movement, very much decried as slave labor, like very, very hot and contested. In terms of what this looks like today these programs house about 4,500 people, mostly men, most of whom will enroll at least initially under some kind of court order. There are between 130 to 140 of them in Puerto Rico, and they have the capacity of about a third of Puerto Rico's formal prison system, which currently holds 12,000 people. So a minority of these organizations look recognizably correctional. Some of them do have gates and walls and barbed wire, but many of them really don't. And a lot of them are actually quite picturesque in rural areas. Some of them look like farmhouses, but even with these more open ones, if residents were to leave and violate a court order, then they would face incarceration, and it's not an empty threat. So it's a kind of, I call it like a strange containment. You're there, but you actually can't leave for all of these other reasons. 93% of these are in the nonprofit sector. About a third of them are going to be evangelical. The other 2/3 are going to be kind of nominally secular or community-based, but really, really drenched in very syncretic forms of Christianity. You really can't escape from Christianity, even in the kind of secular organizations. And they're really, really imbricated in criminal justice. So some of them have fairly big corrections contracts. Some of them have much less formal arrangements, but they're all getting court-ordered residence, and a lot of them are getting kinds of stipends and pays through corrections and justice. And so practically, this correctional twist on self-help rests on a surprisingly simple arrangement. It's one of allowing men who have completed their mandatory custodial sentences to stay put, to live in these facilities for free, and providing them with internal positions as terapistas, social workers, therapists, and volunteers. People often talk about themselves as volunteers. And there's a whole vernacular professional language that circulates in these spaces of the people who work there. And a really common kind of identity term is a reeducado, a re-educated man or person. And in exchange for their contribution to running these programs, reeducados will get free room and board and some in-house privileges, right? We're talking modest things here: a bedroom with fewer roommates, permit to use the car and to leave sometimes. Some who stay for many years might actually end up with a waged position, right? This is the dream. But this formal waged position is pretty elusive. And for the vast majority of the reeducados who overstay their sentence and become volunteers, voluntarios, the work they're doing will either be unpaid or sub-minimum wage, right? From a few dollars a day to like a modest stipend, depending on the institutional organizations of the center. And in my research, this self-consciously voluntary work that people spoke about in this volunteer kind of hybrid professional language just really puzzles me. It really struck me. It was confusing to encounter people who lived in settings where even their juridical status was questionable about what their freedom was, but I had this language of volunteerism. So this was kind of the book that I ended up writing, was one that follows the life and labor trajectories of former drug offenders who have assumed what they understand to be voluntary positions in therapeutic communities upon finishing their own mandatory court sentences. So what is happening with the labor of these overstayers is the book that I've ended up writing. And I explore how this entrance of the self-help nonprofit sector into criminal justice is changing the nature of citizenship among criminalized men in Puerto Rico. And before I delve into the kind of conceptual thesis of the book, let me expand a little bit on the kinds of voluntary work I saw performed under the purview of criminal justice, because I know it sounds a little counterintuitive. And I'll just actually do this by way of one of my interlocutors called Rocky and the program he founded. So this will be like more of a reading. By the time I first visited in late 2016, Comunidad Luz was really just a couple of outbuildings surrounded by a concrete car park. A sign overhead read addiction is curable, and another read God loves you. Like many of Puerto Rico's therapeutic communities, Comunidad Luz is built on abandoned land. In this case, the grounds of a now defunct primary school that closed down many years ago amid fiscal austerity. Rocky, who is now in his 50s, used to be a security guard, but has done time for drug trafficking and armed robbery. If you'd met me back then, he'd say, letting out a mischievous whistle, well, put it this way, you wouldn't want to go near me. Like many of therapeutic community founders, Rocky had an eye for opportunity. The very land on which Comunidad Luz is built, as he would remind visitors, used to be just jungle, full of dead animals and cars. But where others saw ruin, Rocky spied potential. He successfully wangled a couple of loans, one from his mother, another from the church, and he purchased the old school grounds on which Comunidad Luz now stands in the late 90s when local government was selling off public property cheaply. Then, putting his own personal history of therapeutic community treatment to use, he designed his own re-education program. He did this, he told me, by making a list of what addicts needed, quote unquote, based on his own personal experiences. What addicts needed, according to Rocky, was moral character, new norms and values, an education in hard work, and last but not least, a place to call home. Rocky managed to get Comunidad Luz licensed as a residential drug treatment program through the Mental Health and Anti-Addiction Services Administration in 2001. I was interested in the accreditation process, but he told me it had been relatively painless. An inspector had come, told him to lock the kitchen at night because of sharp objects. He also told him to put the television behind bars. The license fee was $125, which Rocky thought was steep, given that they didn't give him anything in return. But nevertheless, he paid the fee. And when people asked him why work with drug offenders, Rocky would reply with some talk of not just standing by and watching suffering. But there was more to it. Rocky shared something with other therapeutic community founders. This was his unshakable conviction that he was uniquely positioned by virtue of his own life experiences to help other men like him. Like other founders, he had a fundamental faith he knew something those psychologists and socio-penales probation officers did not. Rocky now had 12 residents living at Comunidad Luz, 12 men for whom he and he alone was responsible. He talked like a youth counselor, telling men he just met, I used to be just like you, and handing out warnings of falling into vice and going down the wrong path. He would often say, these men need everything because they've got nothing. I've got 12 brothers depending on me now. As Rocky would say, he had found his calling. Though he still didn't have a bank account, and though he still wasn't paid a salary, he said he loved what he did, and the small stipend he pieced together was more than enough. I'll just quote some of the things he said. He said, all that I've suffered on the street means I know how to help. I went through so much. I know how to help other people that are suffering. These men are my brothers and I'd do anything for them. I feel fulfilled, honestly, from not having a roof over my head to having a job that I like and I love what I do. I'm 53 years old and before this, I hadn't done a thing with my life. When I was in prison, I never could have imagined I could do this, that I could be here, helping others just as I was helped. So Rocky wasn't alone. I interviewed 30 therapeutic community founders between 2015 and 2017. Unlike Rocky, many of them spoke really passionately about the work they were doing. Like Rocky, many of them were formerly incarcerated drug offenders, and becoming a peer therapist was the lucky break that many of them had been waiting for. Back in the university hospitals of San Juan, public health researchers that I had interviewed told me a dramatically different story. Therapeutic communities and the reeducados that ran them were, as they saw it, another depressing symptom of the state's failure to respond to the drug problem. At best, they were well-intentioned amateurs who provided basic shelter, but fell woefully short of providing adequate care. And at worst, they were seen as kind of pseudo-professional profiteers who were profiteering and exploiting Puerto Rico's most vulnerable. And these professionals are not alone either. So for decades, researchers have dissected therapeutic communities' clinical and social outcomes. If you read systematic reviews, mostly conducted in the US and in Europe, there are none in Puerto Rico specifically, the evidence that therapeutic communities protect their residents from substance-related harm is shaky at best. And some evaluators say they place their residents at increased risk of overdose following release. So because of this, a lot of people will conclude that therapeutic communities this whole enterprise is kind of a sham. And some would say its only real achievement, if you want to call it that, lies in poverty management, which I think this is interpretation that kind of where I was led to from my own reading on this. And I think it's a powerful critique and it's important, but I think it omits some other really important social scientific questions. So the questions that I set out to answer in this book are, as criminalization and confinement and self-help coalesce within this US colony, what kind of citizenship becomes possible? And more to the point, what do terms like volunteer or self-help actually mean in a correctional space? And to understand these new arrangements of labor and life and belonging that are taking shape in Puerto Rico, I developed two concepts: carceral citizenship and carceral livelihoods. So pared down, the former refers to a mode of belonging and the latter to a way of making a living that has been crystallizing in correctional jurisdictions in many parts of the Americas since the late 20th century. As conceptual lenses, I want to draw attention to how incarceration and capitalism, and colonialism, and this entrance of self-help into the work of criminal rehabilitation are generating new kinds of economic and social participation for formerly incarcerated people. I'll just say a little bit more about what I'm trying to do with carceral citizenship, because when North American criminologists talk about carceral citizenship, they're often pointing out that people with criminal records are barred from voting and housing and state benefits, right? We all know the deal: voter disenfranchisement, exclusions from state subsidies. Criminologists will look at this, and what they see, quite understandably, is an alternative legal reality, and the one that is described as a second-class citizenship, one that is seen as somehow less than average citizenship or second class. And they are right here, right? Citizens with criminal records do experience a circumscribed profile of legal rights and restrictions and even benefits, right? There are like specific services specifically for former offenders. Not enough, but they exist. But to assume that there are like two classes of American citizens, convicted criminals on the one hand, and full or average citizens on the other, is to misunderstand the stratified and racialized and colonial dimensions of US citizenship. So for Puerto Ricans, we've never been first class or an average citizenship. So I'm not talking about carceral citizenship as the opposite to this other homogenous thing, which doesn't exist. So not thinking in binary or dichotomous terms, I think for carceral theorists that I talk to, the challenge is to consider how the carceral turn and the expansion of P&L power beyond the prison and into the nonprofit sector is redrawing what were already highly differentiated possibilities for social belonging. And how does that work? And what are these circumscribed ways of belonging that become possible and not possible? One other difference between how I guess I would approach carceral citizenship and maybe how a criminologist would is that I'm not just interested in rights and kind of benefits and the law. We know that citizenship is also about a sense of belonging, what Durkheim would have called collective consciousness. This is the shared sense of obligation and duty experienced by members of a community. So beyond kind of court-imposed obligations and being barred from housing, and struggling to find work, my work for Reeducados has also alerted me to the remarkable manner in which the experience of criminalization and the experience, the penal stigma it tends to leave behind, have become in themselves kind of important foundations of social membership. For former offenders like Rocky, the affinity that he feels for quote unquote men like him and his sense that he has found his calling is held together by this shared experience of criminalization. And I guess the starting point of my inquiry is that we can't begin to appreciate the lives of men like Rocky and the work they do if we look only at the exclusions imposed on them by virtue of their criminal records. Beyond the legal exclusions, this mass criminalization of men has also given rise to an evident and striking new kinship. This is what I am calling carceral citizenship, and it is encapsulated by Rocky's sense that he is happy to undertake this work and he is happy to have found his calling. If you can bear with me 1 second more, just a tiny bit more theory. My second grounding concept is carceral livelihoods. In many ways, pretty straightforward. In anthropology, a livelihood has two elements: work in the sense of making a living, and living in the sense of way of living or a way of life. So when I talk about carceral livelihoods, I'm referring to both the ways of working and the ways of living that are taking shape in these correctional jurisdictions. And I guess with carceral livelihoods, I'm trying to highlight the fact that for reeducados who live and work in these programs, the work they are doing is providing more than just a means for them to survive. It's also providing a fairly encompassing way of life, which, however fraught, and I'll get to that soon, addresses some pretty important social and existential needs. And I think to a lot of people, this is actually a very troubling idea, to me too. The idea that reeducados could be deriving something meaningful from the work they do can easily be mistaken for some kind of rosy depiction or even endorsement of the carceral state. But the reason I want to take kind of Rocky's work seriously is because if we kind of look at his life purely in terms of the things that he has been excluded from, not the things that he has created, we're really limiting our understanding to the vast changes to work and life and male sociality that have been occurring across the Americas since the advent of the carceral term. So I guess the central contention of the book is that the carceral state is sufficiently extensive and variable and evolved that a closer examination of the ways of living that are emerging in these spaces and of the really morally complicated agency of those inhabiting it is much needed. So I'm going to use some of the rest of the time, because this has all been quite abstract, to do like a little chapter reading. But I think just before I get to that, I guess the overall idea that I'm trying to wrap my head around with is in looking at carceral livelihoods and looking at this labor, is thinking about what the war on drugs has done in Puerto Rico. And I've kind of been led to the troubling realization that it has done a lot more than punish and penalize the poor, though it has done both of these things in spades. But it's also spawned some pretty canny camp followers, right? Men like Rocky, who have spied and seized the opportunities presented to them, and who are now repurposing a colonially conditioned assault onto the poor into a kind of fully fledged way of life. So that's the thrust of what I'm trying to do. And I'm really interested to know if this makes sense or if it sounds horrible. But for the rest of my time, I'll just do a little bit of a chapter reading to share some of the ethnographic material, which just might make some of these abstract ideas, give them a little bit of a hold. So this is from a chapter called The Economy of Penance, and I'll just do a short reading now. Jorge and I make our way down Munoz Rivera Street to the Municipal Sports Center. It's a community gymnasium that can be fitted out, needs depending, for weddings, school tournaments, and other such celebrations. On this hot, cloudless Sunday, the parking lot is filling fast. Cars and limousines line up to snake the corner. Puerto Rico's Chief Justice, the town mayor, and scores of representatives of the Legislative Assembly have all come together with over 80 families to pay tribute to this year's graduating class of Olga Crea. This is Puerto Rico's biggest therapeutic community chain. The attendees mingle in the entrance hall, elected officials drinking cups of Coca-Cola and bumping shoulders with drug court participants. Jorge and I join the throng as it moves rapidly through the lobby and trickles its way around the tables that fan out from the stage. Parents, grandparents, and partners, all turned out in their best attire, are assembling into groups and taking their seats. Among the scores of public officials on the stage that day, when it comes to community recognition, Hector Figueroa holds the upper rung. He's a household name in Puerto Rico, and I can't think of many other places where formerly incarcerated, self-identifying, quote unquote, ex-addicts, right? It's a self-identifying term, can claim greater community standing. And for Figueroa, the presence of the town mayor and the chief of justice, along with more than 250 family members, lends proof and authority to the continued eminence of his organization in the Puerto Rican township. Honorable ladies and gentlemen, he says, today is a special afternoon. We are here to award certificates to this year's graduating class of reeducados. Like all of you graduating here today, I am a product of Olga Crea, and I am a product of the criminal justice system. As he says this last part, he gestures towards high table and thanks what he calls our special friends in the Department of Justice who have got us to where we are today. 3 court judges and the chief of police are sat above. I can tell you, says Hector, it's a beautiful privilege to be here. And after much applause, he turns to the CREA membership. To our honorable directors, he said, we are also here to thank you for the tireless work and sacrifices you have made. Today is a proud day for you too. You have all spent years as internados. You have all made enormous sacrifices, and you all know how much effort it takes to make the journey to become a certified reeducado. And graduates, he says, now if you've put in all this effort, after all your work and sacrifice, you can start to enjoy the success. You can return to your towns as qualified men and women and as leaders in your communities. Together, he says, we can work to create a future for our island. So today is not a typical rehab festivity. It's not a low-key narcotics anonymous kind where members are applauded for achieving sobriety and see the podium. This is a really huge public-facing event. And Hector Figueroa is addressing the soon-to-be class of graduated ex-addicts, right? This is the language, under the gaze of Puerto Rico's high and mighty in an embodied display of recognized leadership and professional achievement. And all of this is happening with all of the grandeur and fanfare of any American commencement. And none of this is lost on the next town speaker, the town mayor, who composes his speech as a commencement address, right? So he says, today you can all be proud of your immense achievements. Now is the time to think about where you want to be in 5 to 10 years. You've already proven you can do anything you can set your mind to. Figueroa reclaims the mic and beckons the audience to rise and sing the American national anthem, a chorus that ends with a trio of flag bearers, tall and composed, making their way slowly down a red carpet that connects the graduates and their families to high table. As the flags of the United States, Puerto Rico, and Ogapre's own signature flag glide steadily down the carpet, the crowd rises again, this time to sing the Puerto Rican national anthem in an equally impassioned performance. Afterwards, the graduating reeducados sit side by side, fists clenched on heart, and serenade the audience with Ogapre's signature hymn. Then the graduates, again nearly all men, are called down to walk down the red carpet, high table, where, after shaking hands with Figueroa, the mayor, and the chief of justice, they are each awarded a medal and a trophy. Prizes in hand, the reeducados assume their seats one by one in a row of chairs that face the stage. And in a time-honored tradition, the next 2 hours are a whirlwind of tributes and testimonies. A reeducado from the Bronx gives thanks to Crea for turning his life around. He says, thank you to my adoptive family here at Crea, and thank you to God. I am proof the program works, and I am proof there is a future out there for you. A wife gives testimony to her husband, as she puts it, clean for 14 years and a much beloved director at Crea. Tears streaming down her face, she implores this year's graduates to follow his example. My husband, she finishes, wiping tears from her eyes, a symbol of rehabilitation and a pride of Puerto Rico. The audience roars in applause, and after the ebbs and crests of speeches, it is Figueroa who closes out the ceremony. With all the fervor of a soccer commentator spying a goal in the making, he reaches his final crescendo. You are honored and certified reeducado. May you never fall back, and may you lead in the fight for a future for our island, a future free of substances. So, I know it's kind of a lot. The moral economy that creates reeducados, right? This is a moral economy that draws men into overstaying their court sentences and assuming unpaid positions on behalf of the carceral state. Is powerfully dramatized and brought to life in these public-facing graduation ceremonies. And I should tell you that in Puerto Rico, these are time-honored traditions and spectacular works of public theater. These are Facebook photos from actually all over the place. One of them was I went to in the Dominican Republic, but in Puerto Rico specifically, these ceremonies have been hosted annually across dozens of municipalities since the 1960s, and they are widely chronicled in local media. They are often attended by the mayor, by governors. In '88, Governor Hernandez Colon attended a graduation ceremony. And in the newspaper called El Mundo, the journalist describes how the governor, and I'll quote, shook hands and hugged many of the hundreds of prisoners who had smiles on their faces, reflecting the alleviation of having woken up from the nightmare of drugs. This is the language. After the ceremony, the governor gave a testimony that was reported in the news. He said, while other countries are known for exporting drugs, we can be proud that an organization born in Puerto Rico is exporting a message so hopeful and positive. So I look at these ceremonies and try to think about some of the cultural dynamics that produce this public figure of the reeducado. And I can see at least 2 distinct traditions. There's more than 2, but I want to focus on 2. The first is that of American higher education. And I think this kind of repertoire is palpably glitzy, but also very secular, in hailing reeducados as certified and accredited, right? These ceremonies are marshaling modern imagery of educational attainment, and they're symbolically recasting criminalized and marginalized men as upwardly mobile, card-carrying professionals who are publicly greeted as such by the governing elite, right? If only for a brief ceremonial moment. And there's also this second symbolism going on here, right? This Christian tradition. And one really powerful metaphor, I think, that has figured in media coverage of graduation ceremonies since the 60s is this of the ex-addict crusader or soldier. And this Christian metaphor casts former offenders and former drug users as lost souls, and it positions reeducados as kind of redeemed soldier crusaders leading a national war against drugs. And so in the archive, I pieced together a lot of journalists writing about graduation ceremonies, and I'll just share a little bit more material with you that I think speaks to this ex-addict crusader metaphor. One comes from the newspaper El Vocero in 2000. The journalist writes, "These men deserve our current congratulations and recognition for leaving a world of indignity engulfed by degrading demands of vice, and for taking the decision to return to this world to save others." So borrowing and blending these Christian and patriotic images, the ex-addict crusader metaphor works to redeem criminalized men by recasting them as saviors and soldiers, and even as national heroes. But this kind of redemption, it turns out, comes at a price. And as I delve further into journalist accounts and also into my conversations with reeducados about their own work, this really complicated moral economy surrounding the work of reeducados began to emerge. And I have come to understand this as an economy of penance, and I believe its logic works something like this. By virtue of their formally criminalized status and the enduring penal stigma, reeducados are publicly and discursively saddled with a moral debt they are told that they have to repay, right? Within therapeutic community literature, much like in our correctional literature, we've all heard of the supposed debt to society that formerly incarcerated people supposedly owe their fellow citizens. And beneath these really conservative overtones, right, is the Catholic sacramental principle of penance, the idea that forgiveness of moral wrong requires atonement and restitution. I think in this logic, it's one of, to pay back the debt, the reeducado has to join the fight, join the national crusade. And over time, I come to see these ceremonies as kind of stages of national theater in which reeducados are called upon under the gaze of their family, their loved ones, and their town to participate in this economy of penance. And they're promised that their criminal stigma will be washed away, that their stigmatized record will be cleared if only they undertake this important national service or duty. Hector Figueroa, the current director of GREA, he encapsulated this idea in an address I saw him deliver in 2016. That day, he stood on stage and he implored GREA graduates to return to their communities as leaders in the fight for the Puerto Rican personality. This was the term he used. And in my book, I look a lot at where this idea of a Puerto Rican personality comes from, what its significance is in Puerto Rico's colonial history, and also in history and anthropology. But now I'll just say that when somebody declares a fight for the Puerto Rican personality, they're doing something very different to when an official declares a war on drugs. At least in the US context, when people declare wars on drugs, they're usually inciting the use of police and military power against people of color disproportionately. But Figueroa's claim or plea for reeducados to fight for the Puerto Rican personality is first and foremost an invitation to join a patriotic endeavor, a complicated one. But I see this economy of penance as a crucial part of the picture for understanding the specific forms of labor and belonging that are emerging in these correctional spaces across Puerto Rico or across the Dominican Republic as well. And I see the ceremonies and the courting of the media and this very public-facing work as essentially working to invite members to enter into this moral contract. If we think of it as a kind of civic narration, the carceral citizen is being summoned to pay back what is supposedly a debt to society. And in exchange, he's being promised a new identity. And this is going to be a celebrated and certified and qualified identity explicitly. So there's all of these logics of debt and penance and patriotism. But one thing that the journalists and families even seem to agree on is that everyone wins when the reeducados join the fight. And what do I mean by that? I'll just read from a newspaper. This is from Primera Hora in 2000. when the reporter says the best thing of all is the double triumph of CREA, that it not only rehabilitates its clients, but also succeeds in creating crusaders. This next quote was from a judge I heard speak in 2017, and the judge said, "The legitimate aspiration of every human being is to succeed, but you have to fight for success. The certificate you receive today is proof you have the potential to achieve success, but with success comes the responsibility to be an example for others." So in this context where criminalization leaves this really hazardous and enduring penal stigma and all kinds of forms of exclusion, we can start to see what it means for Puerto Rican men to assume this reeducado identity. Layered onto these Christian ideas of debt and redemption is this pretty intoxicating promise of patriotic and publicly recognized achievement. And this is a pretty heady cocktail, and it makes this economy of penance very effective at producing card-carrying ex-adictos reeducados who own that identity and who will stay in the programs that they have passed through to perform underpaid or unpaid labor for years that follow. And we don't have loads of time, so this is a really short glimpse, and I'm sure into some of these kind of cultural sides of carceral state formation. I'm sure it leads to lots of questions unanswered. But before I take any questions, I'm just going to signpost a little bit of where I'm trying to go with the book. So for the reeducados I got to know, the carceral livelihoods that they are working pretty hard to invent and sustain are providing their members with some undeniable and desperately needed benefits. So it's not just the shelter, the sustenance, the protection from more oppressive forms of imprisonment, right, like the actual prison, but there's also this brotherly sense of community and companionship that therapeutic communities can nurture. And for stigmatized men gazing down the barrel of Puerto Rico's bankrupt economy, with the stigma of a criminal record and about to encounter some of the most brutal colonial austerity measures seen in generations, these are not trivial benefits. So carceral citizenship shouldn't be completely dismissed as the predictable exploitative antics of a neoliberal state bent on punishing the poor. But there are also things that these men will never obtain. And this is the kind of life that is routinely idealized and routinely promised by liberal rehabilitation, right? This is the achievement of an unmarked full citizenship that is first class and unencumbered by penal stigma, replete with a fair and equal shot at obtaining employment and housing and recognition outside of this carceral circuit. So instead, many reeducados are going to learn the hard way that this re-educated status counts for very little on the outside, right? So by and large, cycles of arrest and rearrest, often compounded by homelessness, unemployment, and problematic substance use, are the norm. And if we think about Jorge, who was the guy whose graduation ceremony I went to in 2016, he had actually, at that time, he'd already graduated 3 times before, right? So he's seen the show 3 times before. He'd spent nearly 8 years as an internado and as an unwaged therapist in several different communities. And when we spoke again in 2021, he told me he'd had a few good years, but he'd been dismissed ultimately for failing a drug test. And when he was dismissed from his post in 2020, this not only cost him his only means of income and his home, but worst of all, it also cost him his community. And this was something that he was incredibly broken by. He became jobless, and when he was homeless and hungry, he eventually resorted to begging at traffic lights and was rearrested on account of vagrancy, which is still a thing. Jorge estimates this was his 13th arrest, and unable to provide proof of stable address, which was required by that particular municipal court, he was ordered to re-enter a therapeutic community. And so at the point of his re-enrollment, he does not resume his former position, right, as a re-educated ex-addict or peer with all of the perks and status and responsibilities that he's worked pretty laboriously to accrue over the last few years. Instead, he joins CREA right at the bottom of the pyramid, right? His re-educated status, so painstakingly achieved, turned out to be forfeitable, and he lost it. And here lies carceral citizenship's one of its most serious shortcomings. While providing its members with vital material security, along with some socially meaningful forms of acknowledged achievements, which I think do matter, it delivers its members to a certified and accredited status that is partial, it is non-transferable, and it is constantly at risk of forfeiture. And this kind of hard-earned membership can be revoked at any time, And it's precisely the same trigger events that start this circuit, right? An arrest, a criminal charge, a court order, that lead to this penalty. And so in the book, I'm gonna really finish soon. I talk about like, is this a historical aberration, right? A partial forfeitable citizenship, is it or not? And I say, well, actually, if we see it through the lens of nearly 3 centuries of US citizenship, the invention of an ambiguous second-class membership that is partial, forfeitable, is not a historical aberration. For most of the nation's history, US citizenship has systematically denied options for social and political participation to whole portions of the population, and lots of hard-earned rights have turned out to be temporary. So I see the emergence of carceral citizenship in the late 20th century as this contradictory, forfeitable mode of membership, not as a kind of historical aberration or exception to liberal democracy. I see it as a particularly vivid instantiation of a broader reality of ambiguous and differentiated citizenship that has been a defining feature of life for racialized and colonized minorities in the United States since the founding fathers. And I'm sorry, there's only 7 minutes.
Wow.
Sorry about that.
Wow, that was very very moving and very powerful and upsetting and inspiring. So thank you for that. I don't want to. We have very little time, so I wanted us to look at the chats and we can stay and discuss as well afterwards.
Sure.
If you have any questions, please feel free.
So raise a hand.
You raise your hand, type it in the chat. Anyone in the room? Yes.
I was curious about, people can Zoom hear me out. Okay.
Yeah.
I was curious about like, because you talked about the two sort of lenses you were looking at this through American higher education and through religion, that both have different discussions of like entry into their system, that like higher education prestige has a lot to do with exclusivity and the difficulty of entry,
Yes.
whereas religion has proselytism and like recruitment as a
Yes.
discussion. And then you talked about having like court ordered into the system.
Yeah.
So if this is like a sort of a position of a certain esteem, and in many ways a position of a unique patriotic signaling, what is both the marketing around and the process of matriculation into this or recruitment into this process?
A drug conviction is the beginning of the.
You know what? Let's take a couple
Yeah.
more questions since we don't have
Okay,
that
Okay,
much
we'll
time.
get to this one. And any more in the room?
I'll jump in one, but
I'll have one.
you go first. Yeah.
Can you say your name?
Oh yeah, I'm Lauren.
Hi,
Sorry, I
Lauren.
wasn't here earlier. Yeah, it was super informative. Thank you for all of the theory and the field work. It's really great.
Thank you for being here.
My question is going to be sort of like we're thinking as we're talking, but I'm just thinking about like relationships to making demands of the state and thinking about I guess in the US right now, there's this moment of like fetishization of self-help and peer related work. And I'm thinking about it a lot in relationship with like the kind of potential co-optation of mutual aid more generally and more broadly by the state. And it seems like there are a lot of parallels here with that. So I'm just curious, like, it's interesting because you're like pointing to and clearly interested in the ways that people are sort of seeing opportunities and making a life out anyway, but also still with these costs. And I'm just curious, what are your thoughts about like the broader political struggle there with like how one might make defense of the state, but also be finding a way to kind of live otherwise, or like, you know, not become totally subjectively like internalizing of this kind of carceral reality, and how we might be like thinking about collectivizing those kinds of energies. And like were your interlocutors thinking in those terms, or like thinking collectively about it, or was it more like individualized of like, I still need to find a way to live, so I'm like making it work? Yeah, I guess that's the question.
Should take any more.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a couple of questions, but you have one, you go ahead. You go ahead.
Sure, I'm Maxwell again. I was gonna ask sort of similar questions, if you could bring back in the mutual aid and also the question of like poverty governance, but I think Lauren's question also brought up for me, just interested in a little bit more of the like political history of how we got to a moment where it seems like there's potentially like a vacuum of let's say like a left-wing movement or analysis of ways to do this mutual aid work that's building against and outside of the state, as opposed to these more kind of carceral capitalist ways. And maybe also interested in thinking about that, to hear a little bit more from the voices of some of the participants who aren't the founders or owners of these, how they understand their place in it, the failings, if they ever break character. And if there's a broader movement that's struggling for like a more collective.
In terms of participants, are there any, did you see any like material differences in those that did stay through and those that did not? Because it sounds like there's like this kind of like empty promise of like a post incarceral like citizenship that isn't upheld outside of these networks. And even within these networks, kind of like the example you gave, it's like very easily revocable. And then also kind of on a similar tangent of my colleagues interested in like the positionality of these people that do stay through, whether as like, you know, co-peers or as like leaders, in that it seems like there is some like good intent in wanting to like support their colleagues, but while also kind of acting as like extensions of like state surveillance and like carceral logics.
Yeah.
So I had a couple of questions, but one, it was in terms of the relationship between the evangelical model that, you know, requiring like superhuman heroism, and not having it, you become a social pariah that loses everything. And the danger of misrecognizing the torture of that for those who absolutely will never be able to become heroes, which is a huge number of us. I mean, I know I couldn't be a hero like that. And so I think that's a fundamental question in terms of the slightly, it seems to me, somewhat dead end debate that you propose it as, I guess, the straw person that you think you need to have, which I don't think you need to have, you know, between needing to valorize this versus the question of whether it's a function, it's only a dysfunctional state that could produce such a brutal way to torture such a large proportion of your population, and so ecstatically impose a manic redemption on them that requires them to sprint the rest of their life against all odds to maintain it when they don't have the resources to maintain it. But and it could, you know, it obviously works well for some people, especially for men. You know, and women have different access to it, you know, because, you know, that's both more difficult, but also easier in other ways in terms of the criminalized relationship. So I found this really interesting, and very practically, I wanted to know how harm reduction could or could never interface with this, and where it does in practice interface, and what the contradictions are between the tradition of liberation theology, which is hyper politicized, which is very similar to the evangelical one. I mean, it's identical to the evangelical one in that it demands heroism of socialists. That's completely unachievable. You know, all the revolutions have failed, you know, even when they've inspired people and helped people. So, you know, but all of the, you know, not that anything is wrong, and not that the beauty of community is ever wrong.
So I'm going to try some of these questions actually bleed into each other. So I'll see what I can do. One thing about Foucault, got it. So also that. So what I will say is, among the people who this kind of circuit has served well, there is a really not just anti-state, anti-medicine, anti-professionalization, anti-regulation. And what puts together all of these things is that attempts to professionalize and medicalize, even to bring harm reduction, are a real threat to their livelihood, to their territory. They don't have any of the credentials that you would need to be in this. So if we suddenly had really woke harm reduction people with medical degrees coming in, that would not be something that Reeducados would want to see happen. And the last 40 years is full of blocking legislation in the legislature that would do anything to medicalize or professionalize. And Helena writes about this in one part of her book, that kind of lobby has done a lot to slow down or prevent kind of things that many people would see to be progress in the field of drug services. In terms of who does well and who does not well, what I find really interesting is that though there are these programs that are saturated in a language of rehabilitation of drug addiction, right? And don't talk about substance use disorders, it's about drug addiction and about re-educating your character in relation to drug addiction. I'm not a physician, but my sense is that many people are loosely involved in the drug economy, sent into these programs and adopt a kind of I'm in treatment for my addiction identity. And lo and behold, the founder, it's really contested, the founder of CREA, it's really contested whether he ever actually had a substance use disorder or whether he just had used substances. And one of the things that seems quite clear is that people who are like suffering with like very, very severe substance use disorders don't do very well because they're constantly going back to the bottom. People who don't probably have an illness, but have now the stigma of a criminal record or the label can work that into something quite reasonable, can do something with it. There's also people who've been to college or university who can be like, well, I'm kind of excluded from the formal economy now. But like the guy who set up CREA had actually gone to business school. Like no coincidence. So that's part of it, I think, is like the stretching of the addict kind of characterological way of thinking to just encompass anybody who ends up there, which could be for a whole bunch of reasons. So the self-help question, it's really hard because once you're in the realm of the carceral state and its reinventions or its nonprofit hybrids and things, it's really hard to imagine a collective action that isn't subsumed by its own logics. And these ones definitely are, right? Their language is it blends criminological theories, it blends early 20th century kind of theories about personality disorders and character disorders and morality. So like in a way, like the whole artifice on which a lot of these identity categories and reward systems are built on are using all of the signs and symbols of criminological stigmatizing frames. So I think what happens is it turns a still stigmatized condition into a kind of status, but this is a really precarious achievement. And outside this space, it's just a stigmatized status, which is why it's kind of the best option available within the space, but it would be really hard to see this as a really good outcome. It's only a really good outcome in comparison to the absolute worst alternative, which is the prison, which is much worse. So I think that if you want to talk about the co-option of self-help, it's even more complicated than that because in a way, it wasn't like we want to privatize this thing and dump it on you. It was like, I see a way to do this. We have skills, we have knowledge, like we could actually do something. So there's a bottom-up grab there as well, which actually I think somebody mentioned Fairbanks's kind of recovery house book. And I think we're like dealing with really kind of similar things because it's like the entrepreneurialism, it's the seizure of the state. Fairbanks things are looking at the way that recovery houses become like mediate welfare, and that's how you get your address and linked into welfare. And in a way, this kind of is quite analogous to that. You're there under court order, you're getting criminal justice money, criminal justice referrals. These people are kinds of becoming agents in this way. So I think there's a lot of similarity there in the location, but this is, I guess, much more closely imbricated to the criminal justice departments than to the social welfare ones. There was a time when some of them managed to pool food stamps, but that's become a lot more challenging to do.
All right.
Sorry I went over, guys.
No,
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
This one.